They say accountants make the worst financial victims. We spend our lives reconciling other people's books, spotting irregularities, and ensuring every penny is accounted for. But somehow, I missed the warning signs in my own household. 45. Years of marriage, and I never once questioned our joint investment strategy. They teach you about auditing and fiscal responsibility in accounting programs, but they don't teach you how to recognize when your own child thinks you've become incompetent simply because you've celebrated your 70th birthday. My name is Eleanor Garrett, retired senior accounting partner at Wilson Maxwell Financial Services. And this is the story of how my son tried to seize control of my finances, completely unaware that I had quietly built a multi-million-dollar nest egg that would make most financial advisors blush with envy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the exact moment I realized my own son thought I was losing my mental faculties. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the maple trees along Oak Ridge Drive were showing their first hints of gold and crimson. I was sitting at my kitchen table, methodically reviewing my quarterly investment statements as I had done for decades. Numbers have always brought me comfort, their predictability, their honesty. Unlike people, numbers never lie if you know how to read them properly. I had just identified a promising opportunity to reallocate some assets from an underperforming sector to an emerging market fund when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, but there stood my son Richard with an unusually serious expression on his face. Behind him was Jennifer, his wife of 22 years, and trailing them both was Melanie, my daughter who lived nearly 3 hours away in Harrisburg. An unexpected family gathering on a weekday morning is never a good sign. "Mom," Richard began, after they'd all settled awkwardly in my living room, "we need to talk about something important." His voice had that carefully modulated tone people use when speaking to someone they believe is fragile or diminished. I'd heard that same tone from junior accountants speaking to elderly clients, never imagining it would one day be directed at me. Richard cleared his throat and continued, "We're concerned about your financial situation." I remember feeling a flash of amusement. My financial situation? The irony was almost too perfect. My son, who had called me just last month for advice on his retirement portfolio allocation, was concerned about my financial situation. "What aspect of my financial situation concerns you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the indignation bubbling beneath the surface. Richard exchanged glances with Jennifer and Melanie before answering, "Your ability to manage it properly as you get older." There it was, the unspoken accusation of cognitive decline wrapped in the false concern of a loving son. I've spent 40 years detecting inconsistencies in financial statements, recognizing patterns in numerical data that others miss, and identifying potential issues before they become problems. These skills don't simply evaporate when you blow out 70 candles on a birthday cake. "I see," I responded, my hands folded calmly in my lap while I considered how to address this unexpected family intervention. "And what makes you believe I'm struggling with my finances?" Richard pulled a folder from his briefcase and removed several pages of what appeared to be bank statements. My bank statements. "Your checking account, Mom. You've written 3 checks that bounced in the last 2 months. The bank called me as your emergency contact." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "And you've been making some unusual purchases. Large withdrawals without clear purposes." I studied my son's face. The face that looked so much like his father's, with those serious brown eyes and permanent worry lines across his forehead. Richard had always been the responsible one, even as a child. While other kids were spending their allowances on candy and toys, he was carefully depositing his into a savings account I had helped him open when he was just 8 years old. He'd gone on to become a successful civil engineer, approaching buildings and bridges with the same methodical precision I applied to balance sheets. His concern was genuine, even if his assumptions were entirely wrong. The bounced checks were an oversight, I explained, which was true but not the complete story. I had purposely allowed those checks to bounce as part of a dispute with Lakeside Wellness Center, which had continued charging me monthly fees after I'd submitted a written cancellation notice. Sometimes you need to create a paper trail of problematic transactions before escalating to legal action, a strategy I'd employed successfully throughout my career. As for the large withdrawals, they were strategic cash transfers to my brokerage account to take advantage of a brief market dip. Something I certainly wasn't obligated to explain to anyone, not even my well-meaning son. Melanie leaned forward, her expression softer than Richard's, but no less patronizing. "Mom, it's not just the bounced checks. You seem overwhelmed sometimes. Last month when I visited, you couldn't find your property tax statement, and you mentioned that keeping track of all these papers was becoming too much." I remembered that conversation. What I had actually said was that the county's new online payment system was unnecessarily complicated and poorly designed. A complaint about bureaucratic inefficiency, not a confession of cognitive decline. But it's amazing how our children can reinterpret our words to fit their preconceived notions about aging. "We've spoken with a financial advisor," Richard continued, pulling out another document from his seemingly endless supply of papers. "Someone who specializes in managing finances for seniors. We think it would be best if you transferred your accounts to professional management. For peace of mind." Peace of mind. Such a lovely euphemism for surrendering my financial autonomy. I glanced at the glossy brochure Richard had placed on my coffee table. Horizon Senior Financial Services. Their tagline read, "Simplifying your financial future." I had to suppress a smile. If they only knew about the complexity of financial structures I had designed and managed throughout my career, or about the existence of my offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Singapore, established 15 years ago as part of a strategic tax diversification plan developed with Henry before his passing. These accounts had transformed our modest savings into a substantial fortune through careful investments in international markets and private equity opportunities that most conventional financial advisors wouldn't even consider for their senior clients. "This is very thoughtful," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But I'm comfortable with my current financial arrangements." Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Mom, we're not suggesting this because we want to control your money. We're worried. Dad always handled the investments, and since he's been gone..." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like a storm cloud. This misconception was perhaps what irritated me most. While Henry had indeed been the public face of our financial decisions during our marriage, attending meetings with brokers and signing documents, I had always been the analytical mind behind our investment strategy. It was a division of labor that worked for us. Henry enjoyed the social aspects of financial management while I preferred working with the numbers behind the scenes. After 45 years in accounting, I had developed intuitions about markets and money flows that couldn't be taught in any business school. But my children had apparently interpreted our arrangement as traditional gender roles. Father handles money, mother handles household, rather than the equal partnership it actually was. Jennifer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Eleanor, Richard stays awake at night worrying about you living alone with no one monitoring your finances. What if someone tries to take advantage of you?" This was rich coming from Jennifer, who had once fallen for a timeshare scheme that I had to help them extract themselves from at considerable expense. "I appreciate the concern," I replied, "but I've spent my entire professional career identifying and preventing financial fraud. I'm probably more qualified to spot a scam than most people half my age." Richard sighed, exchanging another meaningful glance with his sister. "Mom, this isn't about your intelligence. It's about age-related changes that happen to everyone. Even financial experts can become vulnerable as they get older. I understood their concern on some level. I'd seen it happen to others. Brilliant minds gradually dimmed by time or illness. But what Richard failed to grasp was that cognitive decline isn't universal, nor does it progress at the same rate for everyone. Some of my sharpest colleagues at Wilson and Maxwell had worked well into their 80s, their analytical abilities undiminished by age. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, deciding to hear them out completely before responding. Richard seemed relieved that I was at least willing to listen. "We'd like you to meet with Mr. Donovan at Horizon. He can review your current investments, consolidate everything into a managed account, and set up a simplified monthly income stream for you. He can also arrange for us to receive regular updates about your financial status, so we can help monitor for any unusual activity." And there it was, the real agenda laid bare. They wanted access to monitor my financial activities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wondered what they would make of the quarterly distributions from my Bergman Holdings LLC, the entity I had established to manage my international investments. Would Mr. Donovan at Horizon recognize the sophisticated tax strategy behind my seemingly modest checking account balance? Would he understand why I maintained separate investment vehicles across different jurisdictions? I doubted it. Most conventional financial advisors are trained to follow standard protocols that work perfectly well for typical retirees, but fall woefully short for those of us who have spent decades optimizing financial structures. "I understand your concerns," I said finally, "but I need time to consider this. Financial decisions shouldn't be made hastily." This seemed to satisfy them, at least temporarily. Richard nodded, clearly believing he had made progress. "That's fair, Mom. Take a week to think it over. We can come back next Sunday and discuss it further." After they left, I sat in my silent living room, a complex mixture of emotions washing over me. There was anger, certainly. Anger at being underestimated by my own children. There was hurt, the deep sting that comes from realizing your loved ones see you as diminished. But beneath these immediate reactions was something else: determination. A week would give me plenty of time to prepare a response to this attempted financial intervention, one that would permanently put to rest any questions about my cognitive abilities or financial acumen. I spent the next morning making phone calls, first to my attorney, Margaret Chen, who had been both my legal counsel and friend for over 30 years. "They did what?" she exclaimed when I explained the situation. "Eleanor, you're one of the sharpest financial minds I know. This is ridiculous." "Nevertheless," I replied, "it happened, and I need to respond in a way that ends this discussion permanently without damaging my relationship with my children." "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked, recognizing the tone in my voice that meant I was developing a strategy. "I'm thinking it's time for a comprehensive family financial review," I answered. "Can you prepare the necessary documentation for my domestic assets and arrange for a secure conference line with Robert in Grand Cayman?" Margaret understood immediately. "Are you sure you want to reveal the offshore accounts? You've kept them private all these years." "I'm sure," I said firmly. "Sometimes you need to show your full hand to stop people from trying to play your cards for you." My second call was to Robert Lancaster, the financial manager who had helped me establish and maintain my international investment structures. After explaining the situation, I outlined what I needed from him. "It will take a few days to compile everything," he said. "The Cayman account alone has dozens of investment positions, not to mention the Singapore holdings and the private equity participations. Are you certain you want to disclose all of this?" "Completely certain," I replied. "And I'll need you available by video conference on Sunday afternoon, Eastern Time." "Of course, Eleanor. I'll make myself available." Over the next few days, I methodically prepared my presentation. I created detailed spreadsheets showing my complete financial picture, including domestic accounts, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and yes, the international structures that constituted the bulk of my wealth. I compiled performance analytics comparing my investment returns to standard benchmarks over 1 year, 5-year, and 10-year periods. I even prepared a simplified visual representation of my estate plan, showing how assets would eventually flow to my children and grandchildren through the carefully constructed trust arrangements I had established. Throughout this process, I found myself reflecting on how we had arrived at this point. The irony wasn't lost on me that my professional success as an accountant had been built on my ability to see what others missed, to identify patterns in numbers that told stories beyond their face value. Yet my own children had looked at me, a 70-year-old widow living alone, and seen only vulnerability, not capability. They had observed my modest lifestyle, the same 3-bedroom colonial Henry and I had purchased 35 years ago, my 10-year-old sedan, my preference for home-cooked meals over expensive restaurants, and assumed it reflected limited means rather than deliberate choice. What they didn't understand was that true wealth doesn't require ostentatious display. Some of the wealthiest clients I had advised throughout my career were those who lived simply, invested wisely, and accumulated fortunes that would have astonished their neighbors. By Saturday evening, everything was in place. Margaret had delivered all the legal documents I had requested, my presentation was prepared, and Robert was confirmed for our video call. I even baked a fresh coffee cake, my mother's recipe with extra cinnamon streusel on top, because difficult conversations are always better with something sweet to soften the tension. When Sunday afternoon arrived, I was calm and prepared. Richard, Melanie, and Jennifer arrived precisely at 2 o'clock as planned. I could see from their expressions that they expected this to be a continuation of our previous discussion, perhaps me reluctantly agreeing to meet with their recommended financial advisor as a first step toward relinquishing control of my finances. They were not prepared for what awaited them in my dining room, which I had transformed into a makeshift conference room. My laptop was open and connected to the television screen on the wall. Folders labeled with each of their names sat at designated places around the table. A legal pad and pen were positioned at each seat, along with water glasses and small plates for the coffee cake. "What's all this?" Richard asked, his confusion evident as they entered the dining room. "This," I replied calmly, "is our family financial review. Since you're concerned about my financial situation, I thought it appropriate to give you a comprehensive overview." I gestured for them to take their seats, which they did with evident apprehension. "Before we begin," I continued, "I should mention that Margaret Chen, my attorney, will be joining us briefly, as will Robert Lancaster, my international investment manager. They'll be connecting via video conference shortly." "International investment manager?" Melanie repeated, glancing at Richard with raised eyebrows. I smiled and began distributing the folders. "Let's start with a general overview of my current financial position. If you'll open the first section of your folders, you'll find a summary balance sheet." They did as instructed, and I watched as 3 pairs of eyes widened simultaneously at the number at the bottom of the page. My total net worth, which was considerably higher than any of them had likely imagined. "Mom," Richard said slowly, looking up from the paper, "there must be some mistake. This says your net worth is over $8 million. $7,943,622.48 to be precise," I corrected, although that fluctuates daily with market movements, of course. "But how?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your house can't be worth more than $400,000 in this market." "The house represents less than 5% of my total assets," I explained. "If you'll turn to page 2, you'll see the asset allocation breakdown." The second page showed my investments distributed across domestic equities, international stocks, bonds, real estate investment trusts, private equity holdings, and cash equivalents. The largest segment, nearly $4 million, was labeled simply International holdings. What exactly are international holdings? Melanie asked, her finger resting on that section of the pie chart. That's what Robert will help. Explain, I said, as my laptop chimed with an incoming video call. I accepted the call, and Robert Lancaster's face appeared on the television screen. At 62, Robert had the distinguished appearance of someone who managed serious money. Silver hair, tortoiseshell glasses, and the subtle confidence that comes from decades of navigating international finance. "Good afternoon, Eleanor," he greeted me. "And hello to Richard, Melanie, and Jennifer. Eleanor has told me about your concerns regarding her financial management capabilities. I could see my children struggling to process this new development. The financial intervention they had planned had somehow transformed into something entirely different, with international investment managers appearing on video calls addressing them by name. Robert has managed my international investment structures for the past 15 years, I explained. He can walk you through the offshore components of my portfolio, which constitute approximately 50% of my total assets. For the next 30 minutes, Robert methodically explained the sophisticated financial structures I had established. Family limited partnership that held interests in a Singapore-based investment company, which in turn owned a diversified portfolio of Asian and European securities. A Cayman Islands account that held strategic positions in emerging market funds and private equity investments. And a small but highly successful venture capital allocation that had provided early funding to 3 technology startups, 2 of which had subsequently gone public. Throughout Robert's presentation, my children remained silent, their expressions shifting from confusion to astonishment. When Robert finished and asked if there were any questions, Richard finally found his voice. "I don't understand," he said, looking at me rather than the screen. "Dad never mentioned any of this." "Your father and I made these arrangements together," I explained, "but the structures were primarily my design. Henry trusted my financial judgment implicitly, even if we didn't discuss the details with you children." After thanking Robert and ending the video call, I turned to the next section of the presentation, my investment performance. You'll notice on page 5 that my portfolio has outperformed standard benchmark indices by an average of 8% annually over the past decade, I pointed out. That may not sound significant, but compounded over time, it represents hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional wealth accumulation. Richard was studying the performance charts with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. "These returns are extraordinary," he admitted, "especially through the financial crisis and the pandemic market volatility. Conservative growth with strategically aggressive allocations in select sectors," I explained. "It's an approach I refined over decades working with high-net-worth clients at Wilson and Maxwell. The fundamental principles don't change, even if the specific investments do." Margaret Chen joined us briefly by video to explain the legal structures surrounding my estate plan, the revocable living trust, the dynasty trust for my grandchildren's education, and the charitable foundation I had established to support women pursuing careers in financial services. By the time we reached the coffee cake portion of the afternoon, my children appeared thoroughly shell-shocked. "I don't know what to say, Mom," Melanie finally admitted, breaking the awkward silence. "We had no idea. That much is evident," I replied, keeping my tone gentle despite the temptation toward sarcasm. "But now you do. So perhaps we can discuss your concerns about my financial management from a more informed perspective." Richard had the grace to look thoroughly embarrassed. "I think it's clear that our concerns were misplaced," he acknowledged. "Completely misplaced," Jennifer added, giving her husband a pointed look. I served them each a slice of coffee cake before addressing the underlying issue. "I understand why you were worried," I said, softening my approach now that my point had been made. "You saw a few bounced checks and some unusual withdrawals. You noticed that I live simply. You remembered that your father often took the lead in financial discussions during his lifetime. These observations, combined with my age, led you to a reasonable but incorrect conclusion. Richard nodded slowly. We should have talked to you directly instead of planning an intervention. Yes, you should have, I agreed. But I appreciate that your intentions were good, even if your approach was flawed. Melanie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, Mom. We underestimated you completely. It's a common mistake, I replied with a small smile. One that worked to my advantage throughout my professional career. People tend to underestimate quiet, methodical women, especially as they age. That underestimation creates opportunities. As they prepared to leave later that afternoon, I handed each of them one final document, a single page outlining my actual financial needs and concerns. If you genuinely want to help me, I told them, these are the areas where I could use assistance. The list included practical matters like finding a reliable service to clear snow from my driveway in winter, researching options for grocery delivery services for the days when driving was difficult, and helping me evaluate new technologies that might simplify household management. None of these involve managing my money, Richard observed, studying the list. No, I agreed, because that's the one area where I don't need help. But aging does present logistical challenges, even when cognitive function remains intact. I would welcome your support with those practical matters. They left with promises to help with my actual needs rather than their perceived ones, and with a newfound respect that was evident in their expressions and demeanor. That evening, as I sat in my quiet house reviewing the day's events, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction at having corrected my children's misconceptions, amusement at their astonishment, but also a touch of sadness that revealing my financial acumen had been necessary at all. I thought about Henry and how he would have handled the situation. He likely would have found it hilarious, the would-be financial intervention that turned into a masterclass on sophisticated wealth management. You showed them, Ellie, I could almost hear him say, using the nickname only he ever called me. But don't be too hard on them. They were trying to protect you, even if they got it all wrong. The next morning, I received a text message from Richard. Mom, I can't stop thinking about yesterday. I'm still processing everything. Can we talk later? I replied with an invitation to dinner that evening. When he arrived, he seemed different, more tentative, more respectful, as if seeing me through new eyes. I brought something, he said, handing me a small, wrapped package. Inside was a book on international tax strategies. I thought maybe we could discuss it sometime, he added. I'd like to understand more about what you've built. The gesture touched me. It was an acknowledgement of my expertise, an invitation to share my knowledge rather than surrender it. I'd like that, I replied. Perhaps we can start with the chapter on cross-border investment structures. Our conversation over dinner shifted between the personal and the financial. Richard asked thoughtful questions about how Henry and I had developed our investment philosophy, how we had identified opportunities in international markets, and how we had navigated complex tax considerations. I found myself enjoying the discussion, appreciating his genuine interest in something that had been such a significant part of my life, but rarely shared with my children. Why didn't you ever tell us about all this? He finally asked. The offshore accounts, the venture capital investments, the scale of your wealth? I considered the question carefully. Initially, it was about privacy, I explained. Henry and I believed that wealth should be managed discreetly. We didn't want it to change your expectations or ambitions. We wanted you to build your own successes, not rely on future inheritances. Richard nodded, understanding. And later? Later, it simply never seemed relevant to our conversations, I continued. You were established in your career, Melanie. In hers. Our financial discussions typically centered around more immediate concerns, college funds for the grandchildren, retirement accounts for you and Jennifer. There never seemed to be an appropriate moment to say, "By the way, I have millions in offshore accounts." Richard smiled at that, acknowledging the awkwardness such a revelation would have created in normal conversation. "But there's more to it," I admitted. "I think I also enjoyed having a domain that was entirely my own, where my expertise was unchallenged. Once you reach a certain age, people, even loving children, begin to question your competence in subtle ways. Having these financial structures that nobody knew about, that I managed successfully year after year, gave me a private satisfaction." Richard's expression sobered. "We did exactly what you feared," he said quietly. "We questioned your competence based on your age, not your abilities." "Yes," I agreed. "You did. But now we have an opportunity to build a different kind of relationship. One based on mutual respect, rather than misplaced concern." Over the following weeks, our family dynamic shifted noticeably. Richard began sending me articles about emerging market investments, seeking my opinion on his own portfolio adjustments. Melanie, always practical, focused on helping with the non-financial items on my list, researching meal delivery services and home maintenance options. But perhaps the most significant change came from Jennifer, who asked if I would be willing to mentor her eldest daughter, my granddaughter Emily, who was studying finance in college. "She's always admired you," Jennifer explained. "But now that we know the full extent of your expertise, I think she could learn so much from you." The request was particularly meaningful coming from Jennifer, who had initially been the most patronizing during the intervention attempt. Emily and I began meeting every other week, first virtually due to her college schedule, then in person during her breaks. I found myself enjoying the role of mentor more than I had anticipated. Emily had inherited my affinity for numbers, and she asked insightful questions about investment strategies, market analysis, and financial structures. "Grandma," she said during one of our sessions, "I can't believe nobody in our family knew you were practically running a global investment firm on your own. Did Grandpa at least appreciate how brilliant you are?" I smiled at her characterization. "Your grandfather and I were partners in the truest sense," I told her. "He recognized my abilities with numbers and analysis just as I recognized his talents for relationship building and negotiation. Together, we were more effective than either of us would have been alone." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's the kind of partnership I want someday," she said. 6 months after the intervention that wasn't, as we had come to call it in family shorthand, I invited everyone for a formal family dinner. Richard and Jennifer, Melanie, Emily and her brother Michael, and my youngest granddaughter Sophie. After dessert, I distributed envelopes to each of them. "What's this?" Richard asked, looking at the sealed envelope with curiosity. "The next phase of our family financial education," I replied. Inside each envelope was a document outlining a new structure I had established, a family investment partnership that would allow each of them to participate in some of my more sophisticated investment strategies under my guidance. "I've allocated seed capital for each of you," I explained. "You'll maintain control over your individual investments, but this structure will give you access to opportunities that would typically require much larger minimum investments than any of you could manage individually." The proposal generated excitement around the table, with questions flying about how it would work, what types of investments would be included, and how decisions would be made. "Think of it as an apprenticeship," I told them. "You'll learn by participating, by analyzing opportunities together, by making decisions as a family with me as the managing partner, at least initially." Emily was particularly enthusiastic. "This is incredible, Grandma. We'll get to see your investment approach in action, not just hear about it after the fact." "Exactly," I agreed. "And eventually, you'll bring your own ideas and perspectives to the partnership. Different generations see opportunities differently, and that diversity of viewpoint can be valuable." Richard caught my eye across the table, a look of profound appreciation on his face. He understood what I was doing, creating a structure to share my knowledge while I was still able to do so, establishing a legacy beyond just the financial assets I would eventually leave them. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my study looking at a photograph of Henry and me taken on our 40th anniversary. We were standing on a beach in Maui, sunset lighting our faces, his arm around my waist. "I think they finally understand," I said to his smiling image. "Not just about the money, but about me, about what I'm capable of." In the silence that followed, I could almost hear his reply. "They see you now, Ellie. They finally see you." I found myself wondering what might have happened if I had simply agreed to their intervention attempt, if I had meekly surrendered control of my finances to their chosen advisor. How much would have been lost, not just in potential investment, returns, but in self-determination, in respect, in the opportunity to share my knowledge with the next generation. The years I had spent building and managing our financial structures had never been motivated primarily by accumulating wealth. Money itself had never been the goal. Rather, it was the independence that money provided, the security it ensured, the opportunities it created. Now, unexpectedly, those same financial structures had created something else entirely. A new connection with my family, a channel through which to share my expertise, and a recognition of my capabilities that transcended the stereotypes of age. The offshore account that had once represented my private domain had become a bridge to a more authentic relationship with my children and grandchildren. Sometimes, I reflected, the most valuable assets are not listed on any balance sheet, and the most significant returns cannot be measured by any financial benchmark. The family investment partnership began with a modest allocation, $10 million divided among the family members according to a formula I had developed. Richard and Melanie each received a 15% stake, their children 10% each, with me retaining 30% and voting control. Our first official meeting took place in my dining room, transformed once again into a boardroom with folders, legal pads, and my laptop connected to the television screen. "Today," I announced, "we'll review 3 potential investments I've identified as suitable for our partnership. You'll each conduct your own analysis, and we'll reconvene in 2 weeks to make decisions." The selected opportunities included an early-stage technology company developing innovative battery storage solutions, a real estate development in an emerging neighborhood of Nashville, and a specialized healthcare fund focusing on medical technologies for aging populations. Emily arrived early that day, eager to dive into the materials. "How did you identify these particular opportunities, Grandma?" she asked as she reviewed the prospectuses. "Each represents a different approach to risk and return," I explained. "The tech company is high risk, high potential reward. The real estate development offers moderate risk with tax advantages. The healthcare fund provides stable returns with growth potential tied to demographic trends." I showed her how to analyze each opportunity using different metrics: discounted cash flow for the real estate, market comparables for the tech company, historical performance and management expertise for the fund. "The key is not just evaluating each investment in isolation," I explained, "but understanding how it fits within the overall portfolio structure." When the full family gathered 2 weeks later, I was impressed by their preparation. Richard had created a detailed model of the real estate development's potential cash flows. Melanie had thoroughly researched the management team of the healthcare fund. Even young Sophie at 16 had compiled interesting statistics about battery technology adoption rates. "I'm going to open the floor for discussion," I announced. "But first, I want to establish our decision-making process. Each of you will present your analysis and recommendation. We'll discuss the merits of each opportunity, then vote on whether to proceed. As managing partner, I retain veto authority, but my goal is consensus where possible." The ensuing discussion was lively and substantive. Richard questioned the technology company's path to profitability. Melanie raised concerns about the real estate development's environmental impact. Emily advocated passionately for the healthcare fund, citing aging, population statistics, and innovation potential. "I'd like to propose something," Michael said, speaking up for the first time. As Richard's son and a recent MBA graduate, he had been surprisingly quiet throughout the initial discussions. Rather than selecting just one opportunity, what if we allocated capital across all three investments but weighted according to our collective risk assessment? His suggestion led to a productive conversation about portfolio construction, risk tolerance, and the value of diversification. Concepts I had planned to introduce in future sessions, but was delighted to see emerge organically from our discussion. "That's an excellent approach, Michael," I acknowledged. "In fact, it aligns closely with how I've managed my international portfolio for years." By the end of the meeting, we had reached a consensus. 50% allocation to the healthcare fund as our anchor investment, 30% to the real estate development, and 20% to the technology company as our calculated risk position. As our family members gathered their materials to leave, Richard lingered behind. "This was remarkable, Mom," he said quietly. "Watching you lead that discussion, seeing how you guided everyone toward sound analysis without imposing your views. I learned more about your capabilities today than in all the years before." I smiled, recognizing the genuine respect in his voice. "Investment decisions are never just about numbers," I told him. "They're about judgment, about understanding human behavior, about seeing patterns that others miss. These aren't skills that diminish with age. If anything, they improve with experience." He nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I wonder how many other older parents have expertise their children never recognize because we're too busy assuming they need our help, rather than the other way around." The family investment partnership became the centerpiece of our family gatherings, a common purpose that brought us together beyond holidays and birthdays. We held quarterly meetings to review performance, discuss new opportunities, and make adjustments to our portfolio. The structure created natural mentoring relationships. Emily often called me with questions about valuation methodologies. Sophie sought my guidance on evaluating technology trends, and Richard frequently consulted me about tax implications of various investment structures. Even Jennifer, who had no financial background, became engaged in researching consumer trends for our retail investments. When our one-year anniversary of the partnership arrived, I prepared a comprehensive performance report. Our portfolio had generated a 14.8% return, outperforming major market indices during what had been a volatile year. The healthcare fund performed as expected, I explained during our review meeting. The real estate development has appreciated faster than projected due to accelerated neighborhood development, and the technology company is up 187% after the Google acquisition, Sophie interrupted excitedly. She had been the strongest advocate for increasing our allocation to the tech company 6 months earlier, a suggestion I had approved despite some skepticism from the others. "That was your call, Sophie," I acknowledged. "Your analysis of their technology potential proved more accurate than even their own projections." She beamed with pride, experiencing firsthand the satisfaction of seeing an investment thesis validated by market outcomes. "I'd like to propose something for our second year," Richard said after we'd reviewed the full performance report. "Mom has been our managing partner, guiding us through this first year. I suggest we formalize a structure where each of us takes responsibility for specific sectors or strategies, with Mom remaining as the chief investment officer." His suggestion led to animated discussion about roles and responsibilities, eventual succession planning, and governance structures for our family enterprise. I listened more than I spoke, appreciating how quickly they had progressed from questioning my financial competence to seeking ways to extend and preserve my investment approach. "I support Richard's proposal," I said when the discussion reached a natural pause. "But with one modification, I'd like Emily to serve as co-chief investment officer with me. She's demonstrated remarkable aptitude for this work, and I believe she's ready for greater responsibility." Emily looked startled, then deeply touched by my suggestion. "I'd be honored, Grandma, but I still have so much to learn from you." "The best learning comes from doing," I replied, "and I'll be alongside you every step of the way." The family unanimously approved the new structure, with specific responsibilities assigned according to interests and capabilities. Richard overseeing real estate investments, Melanie handling compliance and documentation, Michael researching new technologies, Sophie monitoring environmental and social impact, and Jennifer coordinating our growing philanthropy initiatives. We celebrated the partnership's success and our new organizational structure with champagne and a cake Jennifer had specially ordered, decorated with a chart showing our investment returns. As we approached the end of our celebration, Emily raised her glass in a toast. "To Grandma, who not only built an extraordinary financial legacy, but found a way to share her knowledge and bring our family closer together in the process. And to the future," I added, "which belongs to all of you." Later, as I helped Jennifer clear the dessert plates, she said something that touched me deeply. "I was so wrong about you, Eleanor. We all were. When Richard first raised concerns about your financial capabilities, I was completely convinced you needed our protection. Now I find myself taking notes during your explanations, hoping to absorb even a fraction of your wisdom." I squeezed her hand gently. "The most valuable financial advice I can offer isn't about specific investments or tax strategies," I told her. "It's about recognizing that capability doesn't have an expiration date, and wisdom often comes wrapped in packages we don't expect." That night, I updated my journal, a practice I had maintained for decades, documenting not just investment decisions but the thinking behind them. I had volumes of these journals stored in my study, a chronicle of financial history as I had observed and participated in it. "Today marked a significant transition," I wrote. "The family investment partnership has evolved from an educational exercise into a genuine multi-generational enterprise. I see in Emily the same analytical precision that guided my career. In Sophie, the willingness to embrace calculated risk that led to some of our best returns. In Richard, the steadiness that provides ballast during market turbulence. What began as a response to their misguided intervention attempt has become perhaps my most meaningful legacy. Not just the transfer of wealth, but the transfer of knowledge." As I closed my journal, I found myself reflecting on how completely the family dynamic had transformed in just 18 months. From their initial perception of me as a vulnerable elderly woman needing protection to their current respect for me as a financial mentor and guide, the journey had been remarkable. The irony wasn't lost on me that their attempted intervention had catalyzed this transformation. Without that misguided effort to take control of my finances, I might never have revealed the full extent of my financial acumen, and they might never have discovered the wealth of knowledge I had to share. The following week, I received an unexpected call from Walter Donovan, the financial advisor from Horizon Senior Financial Services, whom Richard had initially wanted to manage my finances. "Mrs. Garrett," he began, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. Your son Richard suggested I contact you." I was immediately curious about what had prompted this call. "How can I help you, Mr. Donovan?" I asked. "Actually," he replied, sounding slightly uncomfortable, "Richard thought you might be able to provide some insights for a panel discussion I'm organizing. It's about sophisticated investment strategies for high-net-worth seniors. He mentioned, you have considerable expertise in this area, particularly regarding international structures." I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The advisor who had been proposed to manage my supposedly diminishing financial capabilities was now seeking my expertise for a professional panel. "I'd be delighted to participate," I told him. "Though, I should warn you, my approach tends to be more dynamic than what most advisors recommend for people my age." The panel discussion took place at the Westfield Financial Conference, with an audience composed primarily of financial advisors who specialized in retirement planning. I found myself seated alongside a retired hedge fund manager, a trust attorney, and Walter Donovan himself. "We're particularly fortunate to have Eleanor Garrett joining us today," Walter introduced me. Mrs. Garrett has developed innovative approaches to international portfolio management that have consistently outperformed market benchmarks. As the discussion progressed, I shared insights about cross-border investment strategies, tax-efficient structures, and the value of maintaining calculated risk positions even in retirement portfolios. The conventional wisdom that seniors should dramatically reduce investment risk misses an important reality, I explained during one exchange. A 70-year-old today may have a 20-year investment horizon. Complete risk aversion can actually increase the likelihood of outliving one's resources. After the panel, several advisors approached me with questions about specific strategies I had mentioned. One woman, perhaps 15 years my junior, asked if I would be willing to speak to her women's investment group. "Your perspective is exactly what our members need to hear," she explained. "Too many of our discussions focus on basic financial literacy rather than sophisticated wealth management." I agreed to her request, finding myself unexpectedly embarking on what amounted to a second career as a speaker and mentor on financial strategies. Walter Donovan approached me as the crowd thinned. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Garrett," he said. "When your son first contacted me about managing your finances, I made assumptions based solely on your age and situation, a widow in her 70s living alone. I never inquired about your background or expertise." I appreciated his candor. "It's a common mistake," I replied. "One that even my own children made. But perhaps there's a lesson there for your practice. Capability doesn't necessarily diminish with age, and some of your elderly clients might have more to teach you than you expect." The unexpected speaking engagements multiplied over the following months. I found myself addressing groups of women investors, teaching guest lectures at the local university's finance department, and even conducting a workshop for financial advisors on identifying opportunities in emerging markets. Emily occasionally accompanied me to these events, our relationship evolving into a professional partnership that complemented our grandmother-granddaughter bond. "You're becoming something of a financial celebrity, Grandma," she teased after a particularly well-received presentation at the Women's Investment Network. "Hardly a celebrity," I demurred. "Just an older woman who refuses to be defined by other people's expectations." 2 years after Richard's initial attempt to take control of my finances, our family investment partnership had grown to manage over $15 million, with performance that consistently outpaced relevant benchmarks. Emily had developed into a sophisticated investor in her own right, recently identifying an opportunity in sustainable agriculture that had quickly become one of our most promising investments. Our quarterly meetings had evolved into day-long strategy sessions, with each family member contributing meaningful analysis and perspective. What had begun as a defensive response to a misguided intervention had transformed into a thriving family enterprise that strengthened our connections while building our collective wealth. A year after establishing our family investment partnership, I decided it was time to introduce my family to another dimension of my financial world. On a crisp October morning, I sent a group message. "Pack for warm weather. Family business. Trip. Departure next Thursday." The responses came quickly, ranging from Emily's enthusiastic, "Yes. Where are we going?" to Richard's more measured, "Need more details for work planning." I replied simply, "Grand Cayman, 5 days, essential for partnership education." Jennifer called almost immediately. "Eleanor, is everything all right? This seems sudden." I assured her that nothing was wrong, quite the opposite. "It's time you all see firsthand how international finance operates. Some things can't be fully understood from spreadsheets and video calls." A week later, we gathered at the airport, Richard and Jennifer, Melanie, Emily, Michael, and Sophie. Only Sophie's younger brother remained behind due to school commitments. As we boarded our flight, I could sense their curiosity and anticipation. "You've never taken us on a family trip before," Melanie observed as we settled into our seats. "Not since we were children, anyway." "Consider it a business expense," I replied with a smile. "Sometimes the most valuable education happens outside conference rooms." The flight passed quickly, filled with conversation about the partnerships, recent investments, and speculation about what awaited us in the Caymans. I revealed little, wanting them to experience everything with fresh eyes. Our arrival in Grand Cayman was met with the island's characteristic warm breeze and brilliant sunshine. A driver awaited us, holding a sign that read, "Garrett Family Holdings," another surprise for my children who hadn't known this entity existed. He led us to a spacious van that transported us to a beachfront villa I had arranged through my local contacts. "This is stunning," Jennifer whispered as we entered the property with its panoramic ocean views and elegant furnishings. "Is this a rental?" "Not exactly," I replied. "It belongs to the partnership, one of our long-term real estate holdings acquired 15 years ago." Richard looked at me in surprise. "We own property here? That wasn't in any of the portfolio documents?" "You shared. This trip is about discovering what wasn't in those documents," I explained. "Some aspects of international finance require in-person understanding." That evening, after everyone had settled into their rooms and gathered on the terrace for drinks before dinner, I outlined the plan for our visit. "Tomorrow morning, we'll meet with Robert Lancaster, whom you've only seen via video calls. He'll give us a tour of the banking district and explain how the Cayman financial system operates. In the afternoon, we have appointments at 3 different financial institutions where our family holds interests. The following day, we'll review the legal structures that protect and govern our international assets, followed by meetings with several investment partners. The remaining time will balance business with pleasure. You should experience the beauty of these islands, not just their banking capabilities." Sophie, the youngest at 19 and studying business at university, looked particularly excited. "This is like seeing the hidden side of finance they never teach in textbooks," she observed. "Exactly," I agreed. "Most financial education focuses on conventional domestic investments. International structures require a different perspective, a different set of knowledge." Michael, always the pragmatist, asked the question I knew was coming. "Are these arrangements entirely legal?" "We've heard stories about offshore accounts." I appreciated his directness. "Everything we do operates within legal frameworks," I assured him. "Tax efficient isn't the same as tax evasion. Every account, every entity, every transaction is properly reported to tax authorities. The structures are sophisticated but entirely legitimate, creating privacy and flexibility, not concealment." The next morning, Robert met us in the lobby of Cayman Financial Center, a gleaming building in the heart of Georgetown's banking district. At 63, he still cut an impressive figure, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who navigated billions of dollars daily on behalf of clients worldwide. "The Garrett family at last," he greeted us warmly. "Eleanor has spoken of you all so often, I feel I already know you." He led us into a private conference room with windows overlooking the harbor, where boats of all sizes bobbed in crystalline waters. "Before we tour the specific institutions where your family's assets reside, I thought a general orientation would be helpful." For the next hour, Robert provided a masterclass in offshore finance, explaining how the Cayman Islands had evolved into one of the world's premier financial centers, how its regulatory system worked, and why sophisticated investors maintained portions of their portfolios in such jurisdictions. "The advantages aren't just tax-related," he emphasized. "There's asset protection, investment flexibility, privacy, and access to investment vehicles that might be unavailable or severely restricted in domestic markets." Throughout his presentation, I watched my family's expressions shift from polite interest to genuine engagement as they began to grasp the complexity and legitimacy of what I had built. Mrs. Garrett, Eleanor, was one of my earliest clients when I established my practice here, Robert continued. What impressed me immediately was her strategic vision. While many clients approached offshore planning with short-term tax advantages in mind, Eleanor was thinking generations ahead, creating structures that would endure and adapt. Richard glanced at me with new appreciation. How did you know to do this, Mom? This level of planning isn't something most accountants would typically suggest. I smiled, remembering those early days. I had worked with enough wealthy clients to see patterns, those who maintained wealth across generations versus those who lost it. The difference often came down to structural planning, not just investment returns. When Henry and I began accumulating significant assets, I applied those lessons to our own finances. Our tour of the banking district included visits to Commonwealth International Bank, where our primary accounts were held, Meridian Trust Company, which administered several of our family trusts, and Cayman Capital Partners, a private investment firm where we maintained participation in several exclusive funds not available to retail investors. At each location, we were received with the deference accorded to valued clients. Portfolio managers and trust officers presented detailed reviews of our holdings, investment performance, and strategic positioning. I stayed mostly quiet during these presentations, allowing my family to ask questions directly and begin forming relationships with the professionals who had been managing components of our wealth for years. During our visit to Meridian Trust, Emily demonstrated her growing financial acumen by asking incisive questions about the trust structure's succession provisions. What happens to the management and distribution protocols when my grandmother is no longer able to serve as primary trustee? The trust officer glanced at me, seeking permission to discuss such sensitive matters. I nodded my approval. The structures Mrs. Garrett established include detailed succession protocols, he explained. There are provisions for determining capacity, transitioning authority, maintaining continuity of investment philosophy, and preventing any single individual from exercising unilateral control. Emily nodded thoughtfully. She's built in checks and balances, she observed. Exactly, the officer confirmed. Your grandmother's structures are among the most thoughtfully designed in our portfolio of clients. Lunch was served in a private dining room at the Royal Palm Hotel, a colonial-style establishment overlooking the harbor. As we enjoyed fresh seafood and tropical fruits, Robert engaged the family in a discussion about global investment trends. The advantage of managing wealth across multiple jurisdictions, he explained, is the ability to capitalize on opportunities wherever they emerge, while also diversifying geopolitical and currency risks. Sophie, between bites of her mango, salad? Asked a question that revealed her quick grasp of the situation. Is that why Grandma's portfolio performed so well during the financial crisis? Because it wasn't all tied to U.S. markets and dollar-denominated assets? Robert looked pleased with her insight. Precisely. When domestic markets experience volatility, having strategically positioned international holdings provides both protection and opportunity. After lunch, we visited Cayman Capital Partners, where we were ushered into a sleek conference room dominated by a massive digital display showing global market data in real time. Julian Mercer, the firm's managing director, greeted us warmly. Eleanor, wonderful to see you in person after all our video calls. He turned to address the family. Your mother, grandmother, was one of our early limited partners when we launched our first emerging markets fund 15 years ago. Her initial investment has multiplied nearly 12 times since then. Richard's eyebrows rose. 12 times? That's extraordinary performance. Julian nodded. The fund identified opportunities in Asian technology and African telecommunications before they became mainstream investment targets. Eleanor has a particular talent for recognizing value before markets fully price it in. As Julian walked, Us through the current portfolio allocation, I noticed Michael studying the structure diagrams with particular intensity. "These investment vehicles," he said, pointing to a section of the presentation, "they're only available to qualified investors with significant capital, aren't they?" Julian confirmed this was the case. Most require minimum investments of $5 million, with lockup periods of several years. They're not suitable for typical retail investors, but for patient capital with the right risk tolerance, they've provided exceptional returns. Michael glanced at me with newfound respect. "So by pooling family resources through these offshore structures, we've gained access to investment opportunities that would be unavailable to us individually." "That's one of many advantages," I agreed. "Scale creates possibilities." By late afternoon, as we returned to the villa, I could sense a shift in everyone's understanding. What had begun as a somewhat mysterious offshore account in their minds had transformed into a sophisticated, legitimate financial architecture designed for multi-generational wealth preservation and growth. Over dinner on the villa's terrace, with the sun setting spectacularly over the Caribbean, the conversation flowed with new energy and insight. "I had no idea," Melanie admitted, "when Richard first raised concerns about your financial management, that you were operating at this level of sophistication. It's humbling, honestly." I reached over to squeeze her hand. "Financial structures are just tools," I told her. "What matters is the purpose they serve. In our case, creating security and opportunity for this family for generations to come." The next morning was dedicated to the legal dimensions of our international holdings. Margaret Chen had flown in to join us, meeting us at the offices of Cayman International Law Group, where we were introduced to Howard Bennett, the attorney who had helped establish our original structures. "Eleanor and I have worked together for nearly 2 decades, Howard explained as we gathered in a conference room with views of the lush tropical landscape. What began as relatively straightforward offshore accounts evolved into a comprehensive architecture as her vision expanded. For the next several hours, Howard and Margaret walked the family through the legal frameworks that governed our international assets, the network of trusts, limited partnerships, private investment companies, and foundations that collectively held and managed our wealth. Richard, with his engineer's mind, seemed particularly fascinated by the structural elegance of the arrangements. "It's like a perfectly designed bridge," he observed during a break. "Each component serves a specific function while supporting the whole." I smiled at his analogy. "That's exactly right. Financial architecture, when properly designed, should be both functional and beautiful in its efficiency." Emily, meanwhile, had been taking detailed notes throughout the presentation. "The succession planning is what impresses me most," she told me quietly. "You've created systems that can outlive any individual, with governance mechanisms that adapt over time." I nodded, pleased by her observation. Longevity was always a primary consideration. Wealth that doesn't survive transitions between generations isn't truly wealth at all. After the legal overview, we were joined by several of our investment partners for a working lunch. These were the entrepreneurs and fund managers with whom I had built relationships over the years, entrusting portions of our capital to their expertise in specific sectors or regions. There was Ananya Patel, whose technology fund had delivered exceptional returns by identifying promising startups across Southeast Asia. Carlos Vega, whose real estate development company had transformed undervalued properties throughout Latin America. And Elizabeth Miller, whose alternative energy fund had positioned us early in what became one of the decade's most significant growth sectors. As these professionals shared their investment philosophies and current projects, I watched my family engage with growing confidence. Sophie asked Ananya thoughtful questions about emerging technologies. Richard and Carlos discussed the environmental sustainability aspects of urban development projects. Emily and Elizabeth delved into the regulatory challenges facing renewable energy investments. These weren't passive presentations, but lively exchanges between my family and the partners who helped manage aspects of our wealth. Michael, who had been somewhat skeptical about offshore structures initially, seemed particularly impressed by the caliber of these investment partners and their comprehensive approach to risk management. "What strikes me," he commented during a brief break, "is how these relationships go beyond transactional investment management. These are true partnerships built on shared values and long-term vision." "That's been Eleanor's approach from the beginning," Robert affirmed. "Where many investors simply chase returns, she sought partners whose fundamental philosophy aligned with hers. Many of these relationships have endured through multiple market cycles precisely because they're built on more than just performance metrics." Jennifer, who had been relatively quiet throughout many of the technical discussions, looked thoughtful. "It's like you created a financial family," she observed. "A network of trusted advisors who know us, care about our future, and work together toward common goals." I hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but her insight was perceptive. "I suppose I did," I acknowledged. "Finance is ultimately about relationships and trust, not just numbers and returns." The afternoon concluded with a comprehensive review of our global portfolio's performance over time, presented in a format that demonstrated not just the growth of our assets, but their resilience through various market conditions. "This chart particularly interests me," Robert explained, highlighting a section that tracked performance through 3 major market downturns. While most investors experienced significant losses during these periods, the Garrett portfolio demonstrated remarkable stability, even generating positive returns during the financial crisis, when global markets declined by nearly 40%. Richard studied the chart intently. "That's extraordinary performance. How was that achieved?" Robert glanced at me. "Eleanor's insistence on true diversification, not just across asset classes, but across geographies, currencies, and economic cycles. Her willingness to maintain positions that might seem contrarian. And perhaps most importantly, her patience. She never succumbs to market panic or euphoria." That evening, as promised, we shifted from business to pleasure with a sunset cruise aboard a chartered yacht. As we sailed along Grand Cayman's pristine coastline with champagne flowing and a personal chef preparing dinner on deck, the conversation drifted naturally between financial matters and family stories. Melanie recounted how she had once asked me for investment advice when she received her first significant bonus, only to dismiss my suggestions as too conservative. "If I had followed your recommendation to put half that money into emerging market funds instead of the hot tech stocks my colleagues were buying, I'd have tripled my returns," she admitted with a rueful smile. "The wisdom of age," I replied, "is recognizing patterns that youth is too impatient to see. But making our own mistakes is part of learning." As the stars emerged in the tropical night sky, I found myself sitting with Emily at the yacht's bow, away from the others. "Thank you for arranging all this, Grandma," she said softly. "Seeing firsthand what you've built, meeting the people who help manage it changes everything about how I understand our family's resources and my potential role in their future management." I patted her hand affectionately. "That was my hope. Knowledge shouldn't die with its creator. It should be passed along, refined, expanded by the next generation." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the moonlight reflecting on the gentle waves. "When did you know you had this talent? For finance? Was it always evident, or did it develop over time?" I considered her question thoughtfully. The aptitude was always there. I could see patterns in numbers from an early age, understand systems and their interactions. But the confidence to act on that understanding, to trust my own judgment even when it contradicted conventional wisdom, that came later, with experience and results that validated my approach. The following day balanced further business meetings with island exploration. In the morning, we met with representatives from our philanthropic foundation, Caribbean Educational Initiatives, which provided scholarships and educational resources across the region. The foundation had been established a decade earlier, another aspect of our financial presence in the Caymans that my family hadn't known about until this trip. We've supported over 300 students through university programs, explained Mariela Diaz, the foundation's executive director. Many returned to their home islands as doctors, engineers, teachers, bringing crucial skills to communities that desperately need them. She shared stories and photographs of scholarship recipients, highlighting their achievements and community impact. This isn't just philanthropy, I explained to my somewhat surprised family. It's investment in a different form, strengthening the social and economic fabric of the region where we maintain significant assets. Healthy communities create stable environments for investment growth. Sophie, always sensitive to social impact considerations, seemed particularly moved by the foundation's work. Could I be more involved with this? She asked. Perhaps during summer breaks from university? I'd love to help with the scholarship selection process or mentoring recipients. Mariela looked delighted by the offer. We would welcome your participation. Having younger generations involved ensures continuity and brings fresh perspectives. I watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction, seeing yet another way the structures I had built were creating meaningful engagement across generations. The afternoon was dedicated to exploring the island, snorkeling at Stingray City, visiting the iconic 7 Mile Beach, and touring a local rum distillery. These activities provided a welcome break from the intensity of our financial discussions, while also helping everyone understand the culture and economy of the place that had become so integral to our family's financial architecture. Over a seafood dinner at a local restaurant recommended by Robert, Richard raised a question that I sensed had been percolating throughout our visit. Mom, given everything we've learned about your financial acumen and the structures you've created, I'm struggling to understand why you maintain such a modest lifestyle back home. You drive a 10-year-old car, live in the same house you and Dad bought decades ago, rarely indulge in luxury purchases. With resources like these at your disposal, why live so frugally? It was a fair question, one that reflected genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Several reasons, I answered after considering how to articulate something that had always felt intuitively right to me. First, I've never equated wealth with consumption. To me, wealth represents security, opportunity, and freedom of choice, not necessarily a larger house or more expensive car. Second, maintaining a modest lifestyle has practical advantages. It creates less complexity, requires less maintenance, and attracts less attention. And finally, I added with a smile, it allowed me to occasionally enjoy the bemused expressions of financial advisors who assumed I was just another elderly widow with limited resources, only to discover I controlled substantial assets across multiple jurisdictions. Michael laughed at this last point. The ultimate stealth wealth approach, he observed, hidden in plain sight. Our final day in Grand Cayman began with a private meeting between me, Robert, Margaret, and Emily. While the others enjoyed a morning on the beach, we gathered in the villa's study to discuss succession planning in greater detail. Emily has demonstrated both the aptitude and interest to eventually assume primary responsibility for our family's financial management, I explained to Robert and Margaret. I'd like to begin a more formal transition process, documenting my investment philosophy, decision-making approaches, and the relationships that underpin our structures. Robert nodded approvingly. We've observed Emily's engagement throughout this visit. Her questions reveal both technical understanding and strategic thinking, qualities essential for effective wealth management. Margaret opened a folder containing legal documents she had prepared. I've drafted an amendment to the primary trust agreement that would establish Emily as co-trustee alongside you, Eleanor. This would allow for a gradual transition of authority, while you can still provide guidance and context. Emily looked simultaneously honored and overwhelmed by the responsibility being discussed. "Are you certain I'm ready for this?" she asked me directly. "I still have so much to learn." I smiled at her self-awareness. Readiness isn't about knowing everything. It's about having the right foundation of knowledge, the right temperament, and the humility to recognize what you don't yet know. The rest comes with experience, which you'll only gain by doing. The four of us spent the next 2 hours reviewing the proposed succession structure, identifying areas where Emily would benefit from additional education or mentorship, and establishing a timeline for increasingly complex responsibilities. By the time we concluded, a framework was in place that would guide her development as a financial steward for our family over the coming years. That afternoon, I gathered the entire family for what I described as the final piece of our Cayman: education. A car service transported us to an unassuming office building several miles from the banking district, where we were greeted by Stephanie Wong, a professional with whom I had worked for many years but whom I had never mentioned to. "My family. Welcome to Secure Digital Archives," she said as she led us through a security checkpoint into a climate-controlled facility filled with rows of metal cabinets and digital storage systems. Mrs. Garrett maintains one of our most comprehensive private financial archives, a complete record of every investment decision, transaction, and strategy implemented over the past 30 years. My family looked at me in surprise as Stephanie used a biometric scanner to access a secured room containing dozens of bound volumes, external hard drives, and a computer workstation. "This is my financial journal," I explained. "Every significant decision, the analysis behind it, the outcomes, the lessons learned, all documented in detail. Some in handwritten journals from the early days, later in digital format, but all preserved and indexed here." Richard examined one of the bound volumes, carefully turning pages filled with charts, notations, and analytical comments in my distinctive handwriting. "You've created a record of your entire financial journey," he said with evident amazement. "More than that," I corrected. "I've created a transferable knowledge base. While money itself can be inherited, financial wisdom typically dies with its possessor unless deliberately preserved and shared." Stephanie demonstrated the digital archive system, showing how my decades of financial records, analysis, and decision-making had been cataloged and cross-referenced for future access. "Mrs. Garrett began this process 15 years ago," she explained. "Initially as a personal record, but increasingly with an eye toward creating an educational resource for future generations." Emily looked particularly moved by this revelation. "This is an incredible gift," she said quietly. "Not just the assets themselves, but the thinking behind them, the how and why, not just the what." I nodded, pleased that she understood the value of what I was showing them. "Financial strategies can be copied," I said, "but judgment, knowing when to apply which strategy, when to be patient, when to be decisive, that comes from experience. This archive is my attempt to share that experience beyond my lifetime." Our final evening in Grand Cayman was spent at the villa, with a chef preparing a farewell dinner served on the terrace overlooking the ocean. As twilight descended and the first stars appeared above the Caribbean, I raised my glass in a toast. To family, bound not just by blood, but by shared purpose and values. They raised their glasses in response, and I could see in their faces that our relationship had fundamentally transformed during this journey. Richard, who had once questioned my financial competence, now looked at me with profound respect. Melanie, who had worried about my vulnerability, now understood my resilience. Jennifer, initially the most skeptical about offshore structures, now appreciated their legitimacy and purpose. And the grandchildren, Emily, Michael, and Sophie, had gained not just knowledge about our family's resources, but insight into possibilities for their own financial futures. "I have one final revelation," I announced as dessert was being served. From my portfolio, I withdrew documents I had prepared before our trip and distributed them around the table. "These certify your individual ownership interests in Garrett Family Holdings, the entity that owns this villa and several other properties around the world. Effective immediately, each of you holds beneficial ownership in our international real estate portfolio." There were expressions of surprise and gratitude around the table. "This isn't just about distributing assets," I explained. "It's about creating ongoing connection to these structures, practical engagement with international finance, and shared responsibility for their management. The properties generate rental income when we're not using them, require local tax filings, and involve cross-border considerations, all valuable learning experiences in global financial management." As the evening progressed, our conversation drifted naturally between reflections on what we had learned during our visit and stories from our family history. Some familiar, others revealed for the first time. I shared how Henry and I had made our first significant investment decision together, disagreeing initially, but ultimately finding a compromise that proved more successful than either of our original positions. I recounted lessons learned from investment mistakes, the technology fund that seemed promising but collapsed due to management problems I had failed to identify, the real estate development delayed by unforeseen regulatory changes, the currency position unwound too early, missing substantial additional gains. These stories of imperfection and learning seemed to resonate particularly strongly, humanizing the financial success they had witnessed throughout our visit. "What I hope you take from this experience," I told them as our evening drew to a close, "isn't just appreciation for the financial structures themselves, but understanding of the principles behind them: patience, disciplined analysis, independent thinking, and most importantly, the balance between preservation and growth. Wealth that doesn't grow eventually diminishes, but growth pursued without adequate protection creates vulnerability. Finding that balance has been my life's work in the financial realm." Emily, who had been quietly reflective throughout much of the evening, spoke up. "The most valuable lesson for me has been seeing how you've aligned financial decisions with deeper values: family security, educational opportunity, generational thinking. The structures themselves are impressive, but it's the purpose behind them that gives them meaning." The next morning, as we prepared to depart Grand Cayman, I found myself standing on the villa's terrace one last time, gazing out at the brilliant blue water. Richard joined me, coffee cup in hand. "I owe you an apology, Mom," he said without preamble. "When I organized that financial intervention back home, I genuinely believed I was protecting you from potential mistakes or exploitation. I never imagined that I might actually know what I was doing," I finished with a gentle smile. He nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "More than that you were operating at a level of financial sophistication that most professional advisors never achieve." I patted his arm affectionately. "Your intentions were good even if your assumptions were flawed. And in an unexpected way, your intervention catalyzed something valuable. This sharing of knowledge that might otherwise have remained private." On the flight home, I found myself seated beside Jennifer, who had been one of the more reserved participants during our financial meetings. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said after we had been in the air for some time. I nodded encouragingly. "All these years, did it bother you that I underestimated you? That we saw you primarily as Richard's mother, the grandmother of our children, rather than as a financial strategist with extraordinary capabilities?" It was a thoughtful question, one that deserved an honest answer. "Sometimes," I admitted. "There were moments when I wished my expertise was recognized, particularly when financial topics arose in family conversations, and my input was politely acknowledged, but not truly valued." Jennifer looked pained by this admission. "I'm sorry for that," she said sincerely. But I'm also curious. Why didn't you correct our misperceptions earlier? Why maintain the perception of being simply a traditional widow managing modest resources? I considered her question carefully. Partly habit. Henry and I had always been private about our finances. Partly a deliberate choice to separate family relationships from financial dynamics. I didn't want to be valued for my wealth or expertise, rather than for my role as mother and grandmother. And partly, I added with a small smile, I discovered early in my career that being underestimated can be advantageous. People reveal more, assume less, and leave opportunities open when they don't perceive you as a significant player. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. I'll remember that lesson, she said, about the power of being underestimated. And I'll try never to make assumptions about capability based on age or appearance again. When we returned home, our family dynamic had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Our usual Sunday dinners now often included discussions of investment, opportunities, or economic trends, with everyone participating according to their interests and knowledge. Richard began consulting me about his retirement portfolio adjustments, approaching these conversations as discussions between peers rather than instructions for an elderly parent. Melanie invited me to speak to her women's professional group about financial independence and long-term planning. Jennifer, perhaps most surprisingly, asked for my guidance in establishing a small investment portfolio of her own, separate from the family's joint resources, her first independent financial initiative in decades of marriage. The grandchildren, meanwhile, embraced their new roles within our financial structures with enthusiasm. Emily began joining me for quarterly video conferences with Robert and our other international advisors, gradually assuming more active participation in these discussions. Michael applied his analytical skills to evaluating potential new investments for our family partnership, particularly in the technology sector where his generation's perspective proved invaluable. Sophie leveraged her interest in social impact by developing evaluation metrics for our foundation's educational initiatives, helping quantify outcomes beyond just numbers of scholarships awarded. Their engagement created a natural bridge between my financial expertise and the family's future, ensuring that the knowledge I had accumulated would evolve rather than disappear. 6 months after our Cayman visit, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at the Regional Financial Planning Conference about multi-generational wealth strategies. The invitation had come through Walter Donovan, the advisor whom Richard had originally wanted to manage my supposedly diminished financial capabilities. Your approach to family financial education has become something of a case study among professionals in our field, Walter explained when I called to discuss the invitation. The way you've structured knowledge transfer alongside asset transfer is particularly noteworthy. I agreed to participate, finding myself in the somewhat ironic position of educating financial professionals about effective practices for working with older clients. The fundamental mistake many advisors make, I told the audience during my presentation, is conflating age with financial incapacity. Some of your most sophisticated clients may be those with decades of investment experience and pattern recognition that no algorithm can replicate. A year after Richard's attempted financial intervention, we gathered for another family dinner, this time to celebrate Emily's completion of her financial analyst certification, a professional milestone she had achieved while maintaining her regular career in marketing. After toasting her accomplishment, Richard raised his glass again. And to Mom, whose financial wisdom proved far greater than any of us imagined, and whose patience with our misguided concerns created an opportunity for genuine growth. I accepted the toast with a smile, reflecting on how completely our family dynamic had transformed. From their initial perception of me as a vulnerable elderly woman needing protection to their current respect for me as a financial mentor and guide, the journey had been remarkable. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my study updating my financial journal, a practice I had maintained for decades. Today marks a significant transition, I wrote. What began as a response to a misguided intervention has evolved into a genuine multi-generational financial partnership. The offshore accounts that once represented my private domain have become a shared educational platform, a means of transmitting not just assets but understanding across generations. In an unexpected way, Richard's concern about my financial capacity created the catalyst for something I had long hoped to achieve, but never quite knew how to initiate: the meaningful transfer of financial knowledge to those who will eventually steward these resources. As I closed my journal, I glanced at the photograph of Henry that still sat on my desk, taken on our 40th anniversary trip to Maui, his smile as warm and encouraging as it had been throughout our marriage. "You would appreciate the irony," I said to his image. "They thought I needed financial supervision, only to discover I had been quietly outperforming professional managers for decades." I could almost hear his chuckle, the affectionate shake of his head that would have accompanied his response. "You showed them, Ellie. You always did know how to make a point with perfect timing." Indeed, timing had always been one of my strengths. In investments, and it seemed in family revelations as well. The offshore account that had once been my closely guarded secret had become something far more valuable than its monetary worth, a bridge between generations, a vehicle for knowledge transfer, and perhaps most importantly, a catalyst for genuine respect and understanding within my family. My son had been right about one thing. At 70, I was at an age where many people begin to require assistance with financial management. Where he had been wrong was in assuming that age necessarily diminished capability, in believing that decades of financial expertise would simply evaporate because I had reached a certain chronological milestone. That misconception, so common, so natural, so well-intentioned, had inadvertently created an opening for a deeper truth to emerge. That wisdom accrues alongside the years, that experience creates pattern recognition no algorithm can replicate, and that sometimes the most sophisticated financial minds are found where they're least expected, in the quietly observant grandmother whom everyone underestimated. Perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all, that assumptions about capability based on age, gender, or outward appearances often miss the extraordinary capacities that develop over decades of thoughtful engagement with complex systems. My offshore account had protected and grown our family's financial resources, certainly, but its greatest value had ultimately been in the revelation it facilitated. The unveiling of expertise that might otherwise have remained hidden, acknowledged. Too late or not at all. In that sense, Richard's well-intentioned intervention had been a gift, creating the catalyst for a new family dynamic built on mutual respect rather than protective concern. Sometimes, I reflected, the most significant financial returns come in forms that cannot be measured by conventional metrics, in relationships strengthened, in knowledge shared, in capabilities recognized and valued across generations. 2 years after our Cayman trip, our family investment partnership had grown to manage over $20 million, with performance that consistently outpaced relevant benchmarks. Emily had developed into a sophisticated investor in her own right, recently identifying an opportunity in sustainable agriculture that had quickly become one of our most promising investments. Richard had embraced international diversification for his own portfolio, implementing principles he had learned through our family discussions. Melanie had established a small investment club among her professional colleagues, applying approaches she had absorbed from our partnership meetings. Even Jennifer, once the least financially engaged family member, had developed confidence in evaluating investment opportunities and participating meaningfully in financial decisions. The quarterly meetings of our partnership had evolved into day-long strategy sessions, with each family member contributing meaningful analysis and perspective. What had begun as a defensive response to a misguided intervention had transformed into a thriving family enterprise that strengthened our connections while building our collective wealth. The offshore account, that simple financial structure established decades earlier, had ultimately yielded returns far beyond monetary measurements, creating a legacy of knowledge, respect, and shared purpose that would endure long after account balances ceased to matter. As I approached my 75th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The financial structures I had built throughout my career had served their intended purpose, certainly, growing, and protecting our family's resources across market cycles and economic fluctuations. But their most valuable function had proven to be something I had never specifically designed them to do: creating a platform for intergenerational connection, for the transmission of not just assets, but wisdom, for the recognition of capability that transcends conventional expectations. In that sense, the true value of my offshore account hadn't been measured in dollars or returns, but in the transformative effect it had on our family's understanding of each other and ourselves. The finest investment strategies, I wrote in what would become the final volume of my financial journals, account not just for market risks and returns, but for human nature, for the psychology that drives decisions, for the relationships that give wealth its meaning, for the transfer of knowledge across generations. The offshore account that my son once viewed with suspicion ultimately became the vehicle through which our family discovered a deeper connection, one built on respect for expertise regardless of age, on recognition of capability beyond conventional assumptions, and on the understanding that financial wisdom, properly shared, grows rather than diminishes with time. 3 years after Richard's attempted financial intervention, I received an invitation that brought our journey full circle. The Westfield Financial Conference, where I had first spoken on a panel alongside Walter Donovan, asked me to deliver the keynote address at their annual symposium for financial advisors. The topic they suggested: recognizing financial capacity. Beyond age, lessons for advisors, working with senior clients, seemed particularly fitting given our family's experience. I accepted, seeing an opportunity to challenge industry assumptions about older clients and their capabilities. The conference center was filled to capacity when I took the stage. Hundreds of financial professionals, many younger than my children, all there to hear what an elderly woman might teach them about their profession. "I stand before you today," I began, "as someone who was once the subject of a well-intentioned but fundamentally misguided financial intervention by my own family. My son, concerned about my advancing age and observing what he interpreted as signs of financial difficulty, attempted to transfer control of my finances to a professional advisor, one who might be sitting in this room today." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the audience. What he didn't know, what none of my family knew at that time, was that I maintained sophisticated offshore investment structures that had outperformed market benchmarks for decades, managed international real estate holdings across 3 continents, and had established philanthropic initiatives that operated largely beyond their awareness. For the next 45 minutes, I shared our family's journey, not as a story of vindication or embarrassment, but as a case study in the dangers of age-based assumptions about financial capacity. I outlined the signals that had led my son to question my financial competence, the bounced checks that were actually part of a strategic dispute with a service provider, the confusion over finding documents that was actually frustration with poorly designed systems, and contrasted them with the sophisticated financial structures I had built and maintained. The fundamental error, I explained, wasn't in my son's concern for my well-being. That came from a place of genuine love. The error was in assuming that age necessarily diminishes financial capacity, that chronological milestones inevitably correspond to cognitive decline. I closed my presentation by outlining recommendations for financial professionals working with older clients, approaches that honored experience while providing appropriate support, that recognized the distinction between normal aging and actual cognitive impairment, that respected the wisdom accumulated through decades of market participation. "The greatest disservice you can do your senior clients," I told the audience, "is to underestimate their capabilities based on birth date rather than behavior, to assume vulnerability where there may in fact be extraordinary resilience and expertise. The second greatest disservice is to focus exclusively on asset preservation at the expense of growth opportunities. constraining portfolio potential based on age-based assumptions rather than individual goals and risk tolerance. The standing ovation that followed my presentation was gratifying, but even more meaningful were the conversations afterward. Financial advisors sharing their own stories of underestimating older clients, of discovering unexpected expertise beneath seemingly traditional exteriors, of learning to recognize the value of pattern recognition developed over decades of market experience. Many admitted that industry practices often subtly diminished older clients, particularly women, treating them as beneficiaries to be protected rather than principals to be served. "Your story has changed how I'll approach these relationships," one young advisor told me. "I'll be listening differently, asking different questions, looking for capacity rather than assuming its absence." Walter Donovan approached me as the crowd thinned, a rueful smile on his face. "You've become something of a legend in our industry, Eleanor," he said. "The sophisticated grandmother who outsmarted the professionals. I'm almost grateful that your son contacted me about managing your finances, even though it never happened. Being part of your story has taught me more than decades of professional training." I appreciated his candor and good humor. "Perhaps there's a lesson there about assumptions and appearance," I suggested. "Some of your most sophisticated clients may be the ones who drive modest cars, live in modest homes, and never quite fit the profile you expect of high-net-worth individuals." Richard attended the conference with me, sitting in the front row during my presentation. As we drove home afterward, he seemed thoughtful. "Listening to you today, I realized something I hadn't fully processed before," he said. "When I organized that intervention, I genuinely believed I was protecting you. But underlying that concern was an assumption that I inherently knew better, that my judgment at 55 was automatically superior to yours at 70, regardless of your expertise or experience." He glanced over at me. "That's a form of arrogance, isn't it? Age-based arrogance." I considered his insight. "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but it's a culturally reinforced arrogance. Everything in our society tells us that youth confers advantage. That age inevitably brings decline. Resisting those assumptions requires conscious effort." As I approached my 80th birthday, our family investment partnership had evolved into a sophisticated enterprise managing assets across multiple jurisdictions, with each family member contributing according to their interests and capabilities. Emily had gradually assumed primary responsibility for our international investments, working closely with Robert and our other advisors. Richard oversaw our domestic real estate portfolio, applying his engineering background to evaluating properties and improvement opportunities. Melanie managed our philanthropic initiatives, expanding our educational foundation beyond the Caribbean to support students across Latin America. The grandchildren had each developed specialized knowledge: Michael in technology investments, Sophie in environmental sustainability, and young Thomas, who had been too young for our original Cayman trip, showing promising aptitude for financial analysis despite being only 16. For my 80th birthday celebration, the family surprised me with a unique gift: a leather-bound book titled Financial Wisdom: The Eleanor Garrett Legacy. They had compiled excerpts from my decades of financial journals, organized by theme rather than chronology, creating a distillation of my investment philosophy and approach. "We wanted to capture your thinking in a format that could be shared beyond the archives," Emily explained as I paged through the beautiful volume with its carefully selected passages, annotated charts, and thoughtfully organized sections. "This is just the first copy. We're having additional ones printed for each family member and for key advisors who have worked with you over the years." The gesture touched me deeply, not just for the effort it represented, but for what it symbolized. About our journey, from questioning my financial capacity to recognizing value in my approaches that merited preservation and dissemination, the transformation had been remarkable. "The irony isn't lost on me," Richard commented during the celebration, "that we went from worrying about Mom's financial management to publishing a book about her investment wisdom in just 10 years. Jennifer laughed. It's a reminder never to underestimate Eleanor or any other 70-something woman living in a modest house and driving a sensible car. She might just be managing international investments between bridge club meetings. Looking around at my family that evening, 3 generations engaged in animated conversation about investment opportunities, market trends, and the philosophical underpinnings of financial decisions, I felt a profound sense of completion. The offshore account that had once been my private domain had served its purpose, not just in growing our family's resources, but in creating a vehicle for knowledge transfer and mutual respect. The financial intervention that had once seemed threatening had ultimately catalyzed a transformation in our family dynamics, creating space for expertise to be recognized and valued across generational lines. What had begun as a potential conflict had evolved into a collaborative enterprise that strengthened both our financial position and our personal connections. The greatest wealth, I told them during a quiet moment in the celebration, isn't measured in dollars or investment returns. It's found in relationships built on mutual respect, in knowledge shared across generations, in values that guide decisions beyond immediate self-interest. The financial structures we've built together are significant, certainly, but their greatest value lies in the conversations they've generated, the capabilities they've revealed, and the connections they've strengthened. Emily raised her glass. To Grandma, who taught us that financial wisdom doesn't expire at some arbitrary age, that quiet expertise often outperforms loud confidence, and that the most sophisticated investments sometimes come wrapped in the most unassuming packages. As I blew out the candles on my birthday cake, fewer than 80 by mutual agreement, I made a silent wish, not for investment returns or financial success, but for continued opportunities to share what I had learned, to challenge assumptions about capability based on age, and to demonstrate through example that wisdom accumulates alongside years when paired with curiosity and continued engagement. The offshore account that had once seemed merely a tax-efficient structure had ultimately yielded returns far beyond financial metrics, in family relationships strengthened, in expertise recognized, in knowledge preserved and transmitted across generations. My son had indeed been wrong about my ability to manage money at 70, but his well-intentioned error had created an opening for a deeper truth to emerge. That financial wisdom, properly nurtured and shared, grows richer with time. That capabilities need not diminish with age. And that sometimes the most sophisticated financial minds are found where they're least expected, in the quiet grandmother whom everyone had underestimated, who had quietly outperformed financial benchmarks for decades while driving a sensible car and living in a modest home. In the end, perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all, that appearances rarely tell the complete story, that capability transcends conventional expectations, and that wisdom, when recognized and respected, creates returns that no financial statement can fully measure. The true legacy of wealth, I wrote in the final entry of my financial journal, isn't found in account balances or investment returns, but in the values it expresses, the opportunities it creates, and the knowledge it transmits. My offshore account began as a financial strategy, but its greatest return proved to be something no prospectus could have projected: a transformation in family dynamics, a recognition of capability beyond conventional assumptions, and a framework for collaboration across generations. Perhaps that's the wisest investment of all, the one that yields not just financial security, but mutual respect, shared purpose, and connections that no market fluctuation can diminish. My son had said, I was too old to manage my own money. He had no idea about my secret offshore account. But more importantly, he had no idea that his misguided concern would ultimately create the catalyst for a journey that enriched our family far beyond financial metrics. A journey of discovery, respect, and shared purpose that no balance sheet could fully capture, but whose returns would continue compounding long after account statements ceased to matter. Sometimes, I reflected as I looked around at my family engaged in animated financial discussion, The most valuable investments yield returns that no algorithm can project, in relationships strengthened, in capabilities recognized, in wisdom shared across generations. And those returns, unlike market gains, truly are timeless. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.